Chapter 27. 2 months later. Carter. "Thanks for coming, Dad," Carter said, giving his father a hug. The older man was stiff beneath his arms, but Carter didn't take it personally. It had been years since he'd hugged his father, and it had probably been about that long since his father had hugged anyone else. "Well, I can't say I approve of you getting married. After all, you know how it turned out for me. But I wanted to support you." His father had always had a deep voice, but Carter knew the gruff tone he was hearing now was his dad's way of hiding his emotion. "I'm glad you did. Honestly, I didn't think I'd ever be getting married either, Dad. But April is amazing, and letting God back into my life definitely made a difference." His father waved his hand dismissively. "I'm not sure about that. God left me when he let your mother leave." Carter clapped a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, you know that's not the case. God gives us free will. He allowed Mom to leave, but he didn't make her go. And he's allowing you to be mad at him, but he's hoping you'll find your way back." "Maybe we can talk about that later. Today is your day, and I will be happy for you." Carter wanted to push the issue. After losing Jay, he'd come to realize that life was unpredictable, and no one knew how much time they had. He wanted to be sure his father was up in heaven with him, but he also knew that his father was stubborn, just like he was, and he would come around on his own time. All Carter could do was plant the seed and trust that God would send someone to water it. "Okay, Dad. Well, are you ready then?" Carter knew the other guys were already waiting outside. He'd asked for a few moments with his father since it had been so long since they'd talked. With a nod and a sniff that he played off as allergies, his father opened the door and led the way into the hallway. Tucker, Blaine, Mason, and Jefferson snapped to attention. "Are we ready to do this?" Jefferson asked, his gaze asking the deeper question. Is everything okay? Carter smoothed his jacket one last time and smiled. This would be his last day as a single man, something he never thought would happen. But he wasn't scared. A little nervous, perhaps, but he knew God was in control. "Let's do this." The men headed to the sanctuary, but only Carter, his father, and Jefferson entered. Carter couldn't help but think that just a few months ago, he'd been one of those guys standing in the hallway, waiting for the bridesmaids, and now he was going to be the one up at the altar. "It's funny how God changes things, isn't it?" Jefferson asked, as if reading his mind. His friend was way too good at that, but Carter was fairly certain he'd become more of an open book in the last few months as well. "It is. I don't know if I ever thanked you, but I'm pretty sure you saved my life, Jefferson." Jefferson shook his head. "You saved your life, Carter. All I did was give you the information you needed to make the decision, and that is what God calls all of us to do. Still, thank you, and thank you for standing here with me today." "Happy to, brother. I wouldn't miss this for the world." The music started then, and the back doors opened. Carter's eyes turned toward the door, and a nervous energy began to build in his stomach. He could not wait to see April step through the door. When she appeared, his breath caught in his chest. Though she was beginning to show now, the dress she'd picked hid the bump fairly well. With long, flowy sleeves and a large skirt with an impressive train, the attention was definitely drawn to other aspects. Her fiery red hair was piled on top of her head and surrounded with flowers. Only a few tendrils escaped and hung by her face like dainty red springs. He could not help the smile that pulled at his lips. When she reached him, she handed her bouquet to Lucia before turning back to take his hand. The pastor began the ceremony then, but Carter could barely concentrate on the words. The only thing in his mind right then was April and getting to spend the rest of his life with her. "I can't believe we're actually married," April said as she looked out over the reception area. Around them, couples swayed to the slow music under the lowered lights and twinkling stars that had been strung from one side of the room to the other. Though not outside, the ambience of the room created that feeling in an intimate and climate-controlled manner. Carter pulled her closer. Me either. Who would have ever thought that two people like us would have wound up together? Not me. She glanced over to Lucia and Jefferson. I think they might have known, though. Carter could agree with that. Even if they hadn't known, he was fairly certain Jefferson had had an idea, and had also served as the catalyst that propelled them together. Yeah, I've already thanked him for introducing us. April smiled up at him. You did? I thanked Lucia, too. Great minds think alike, he whispered, before placing a soft kiss on her lips. You know what else is amazing? What's that? Her voice was breathy and her eyes were still half closed, but he needed her to see this to believe it. Look. He pointed to another couple on the dance floor, an older couple hardened by the trials of life, but managing to smile at one another at the moment. Is that your mother and my father? Carter asked with a smile. Yep. Though he wondered how weird it would be if their parents married each other. That would be hard to explain to their children. He was glad to see his father smiling. I haven't seen my mother that happy in a long time, April said, her eyes glued to the pair, who seemed to be in a world all their own. Haven't seen my dad look like that in ages either. Carter shook his head as he thought back over the road they'd traveled to get here. Wouldn't it be something if not only did he find love, but if his father found it again too? All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the bouquet toss, the DJ said as he lowered the music. I need all the single ladies out on the dance floor. As April scanned the room for Lucia, who was in charge of the bridal bouquet, Carter scanned the room for a different purpose. Were there any single women left? He was sure some of the guests were single, or had brought dates who were technically single, but he realized that among their group, there were no single women other than Haley, and she was a little young to be catching the bouquet. You too, Mom, April said as Lucia handed her the flowers. Her mother's cheeks flushed, and she waved her hand to dismiss the idea, even as she looked up at Carter's father. I don't count. I've been married before. But you're single now, so get out there. April's mother narrowed her eyes as if she wanted to protest further, but she joined the other women. Perhaps she'd also realized that protesting would only draw more attention to her. Carter bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling at April's gumption. Though he appreciated her stubbornness now, he knew it would likely be a bone of contention between them one day in their marriage, and he silently asked God for the wisdom to deal with those situations in the right way when they arose. All right, ladies. The DJ's voice pulled him back to the event at hand. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. At the final word, April launched the flowers over her head, and Carter watched as they sailed through the air, spinning once before landing squarely in her mother's hands. A cheer erupted in the small crowd of people, but Carter wasn't sure who was more surprised, April, her mother, or his father, whose mouth fell open as the color drained out of his face. Well, this could be interesting, April said as she returned to his side. You can say that again, he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. If they get married, explaining grandparents to the kids is going to be a challenge. But, she said, turning her body to his so she could wrap her arms around his neck. At least we wouldn't have to share holidays. Carter chuckled and shook his head. You know, I think your quirky sense of humor may be the thing I love most about you." And here I thought it was my hair. Her eyes twinkled like the sparkly lights above them. "I love that too," he said, dropping his voice and blocking out all the sounds around them. "In fact, I don't think there's anything I don't love about you." April's eyes glinted mischievously. "I can think of one thing." "Oh yeah? What's that?" "That we aren't somewhere alone right now." A smile stole across his lips as he leaned closer to her ear. "Well, that is something we can definitely remedy, Mrs. Young." Mrs. Young. He'd never thought there would be another one of those in his family. But he was quickly learning that God often liked to make things happen that seemed impossible. "I think we should," she said, and Carter couldn't have agreed more.